Should the federal government centralize additional powers in order to, from the top down, ensure equality across the nation? Or should states hold on to as much power as possible, even though it may lead to discrepancies in what laws are passed and how they're enforced from state to state? Politics is a passion of mine, and nearly every day I watch or listen to a bevy of political commentators. I've also amassed a small library of political books, and I hope to grow that library through the years. In all of this, I've noticed that this argument over political power and who should wield it has been with our nation throughout its history, and I think that it will be with us forever. You probably already have an opinion on the debate, whether you've thought about it in those particular terms or not before. This is because this debate affects many aspects of your life, and it will continue to affect new aspects of your life as they crop up moving forward. Today I'm going to explain why I think that the state should hold on to as much power as possible without nullifying the existence of the federal government. I'm going to explain why I think this is the best way to provide for the American people and to protect their freedoms. I'm going to do so by addressing each of the following. First, I want to define the debate. Second, I want to look at the schooling system specifically and see the federal government's role there. And finally, I want to explain the arguments made today for a smaller federal government. I'll begin by briefly defining the debate and talking about where it came from. The interesting thing about this debate is that people on both sides have the same motivations. We all want the same things. We want to be free, we want to be safe, and we want our families to have the same blessings. The Federalists and the Anti-Federalists were the two parties that were the big parties of the day when the nation was founded. The Federalist Party, at the founding of the nation, wanted to repeal the Articles of Confederation and replace it with the newly proposed Constitution. They were afraid that the Articles of Confederation didn't have the powers necessary to hold the states together in times of conflict or in times of crisis. They also thought that this centralization of power would better protect the rights of the American people across the board. At the same time, however, the Anti-Federalist Party feared that if we centralized too much power, we would give rise to tyranny from within. They were afraid that if the states didn't remain mostly sovereign, we'd be putting ourselves back in the situation we had only just escaped. John Dewey of the Anti-Federalist Party wrote in Anti-Federalist 2 about fearing a war. He was afraid that because the Constitution was so hard to amend, the only way it would really ever be amended was by force of arms, and he desperately didn't want to see the young nation plunged back into conflict. I believe that the Founding Fathers needed to ratify the Constitution in order to form a more perfect union, a quote from the Constitution itself. And I'm glad that they did, but I think that it's overgrown its usefulness. We can look to the schooling system now to see where it's overgrown its usefulness and in some of the ways that it's not being effective. We all want our kids to have a quality education, and some people argue that the federal government needs to come in from the top down and ensure an equal schooling experience across the board for our children. This argument's true in that it's the only way to achieve an equal schooling experience, but it assumes the premise that we want an equal schooling experience. I don't think that we do. I think that children who are growing up in rural Kansas don't necessarily need an equal schooling experience to children growing up in downtown Oakland, for instance. Students learn differently based on a lot of different factors, but certainly some of these factors are where they're growing up and what their life experiences are. I believe that the federal government has overgrown its usefulness and that we can prove it by looking at the statistics. According to the Pew Research Center, 15-year-olds in the United States rank 24 in science and reading, and they fall all the way to 39 in mathematics. Clearly, the No Child Left Behind and the Every Child Succeeds Acts have both failed. These were acts passed by Congress that were supposed to, from the top down, lift our students and help them to do better in schooling, but clearly that's not working. I contend that if state and local governments were more in charge of the schooling system, it would drive competition between the states. This, in turn, would drive innovation and improvements across the nation throughout our schooling system. I think that this would be because people want a good education for their kids, like we already talked about, and because the states need taxpayers in order to stay valid. So, to bring in taxpayers, the states would have to compete to provide a better schooling experience than the states next to them. Because people are more or less free to move throughout the country, this would keep that competition ever going, and it would keep that innovation continuing. These same principles that lead in the schooling debate can be scaled outward to almost every aspect of our life when it comes into view of what the federal government should be doing for us. So when we talk about today's arguments, Let's remember that we've already talked about a lot of them in the schooling system, just scale them out to any new topic. Basically, the federal government is too big. It covers too large a swath of people who vary too widely to be able to lay out blanket policies that would best suit every community and every person across the nation. State and local governments are much better equipped to deal with their local and very specific circumstances and challenges. This is because they're closer to the issues. The leaders in those state and local governments live in the areas, and they have to deal more directly with the consequences of legislation that's passed. Additionally, consolidating too much power can be dangerous. We can look to history, and some of it not too far distant, for examples of why the consolidation of power can be dangerous for people. Venezuela, for an example, recently consolidated power within itself, and they were doing so on the backs of promises that were made by an up-and-coming politician. He promised people who felt downtrodden and not cared for by their government that he would take care of them, and so people voted in to give more and more power to him. After he came into power, the government continued to accrue more and more power, but the promises weren't kept. Jessica Dellinger from the World Atlas wrote that people are now forced to eat dogs and garbage to stay alive, even though they sit on the largest oil reserves in the world. As in other regimes, Mao, Stalin, and Hitler, for example, dissenters and protesters have been violently silenced. In conclusion, we've addressed what the debate is, we've defined it, we've focused specifically on the schooling system and how the federal government has had an effect there, or not had an effect, and we've discussed some of the arguments made today for a smaller federal government. I don't foresee this debate fading away or becoming less important, and in fact, with technological advances that are always coming our way, I believe that both its impact and its importance will continue to grow ever more important. The federal government is not only incapable of writing top-down proposals that best benefit people across the board throughout the nation, it also can't be trusted with the power to do so. To give over too much power would be to put our own rights, liberties, and freedoms at stake. The outcomes of this debate have impacts on nearly every facet of our lives, and if we're not careful, the consequences of making the wrong decision could be dire. I do think that it's possible that people who come into power initially may take that power and use it for the betterment of the people who elected them. I don't think that that's off the table, but eventually that power is going to be passed on to someone else, and eventually that power will be passed on to a leader who will put his own interests above the interests of his people, and that government will rule in tyranny. Thank you for your time.